Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. I did my grad work at Guelph, so it's always nice to be back on campus. I am not doing what I thought I would be doing when I was a student here at Guelph. I really thought that my job and my role in conservation would be very different, and that if we could develop the science and the facts, we could change people's minds, and that would transform the world. And that's not really working out quite the way I thought. I was recently cleaning out my mom's house, and I came across this poster, which reminded me, sort of flashback to like early 1990s on campus, Western Wilderness Committee, Save the Stein Valley. And when I bought this poster, I really kind of had this sense that, there were environmental villains and there were environmental saviors, and they were at opposite ends. And it was a zero-sum game. What we won, they lost. What they won, we lost. And I've really kind of come to realize that conservation doesn't work well that way. The world doesn't work well that way. And One Health may offer us an opportunity to find that common ground in conservation, and an opportunity to discover that we actually have more in common as people than what divides us. And this sort of dichotomy between economy and environment, I spent the first part of my career sort of thinking that way, that it was this us versus them, but realizing that just doesn't work. There are no good guys, no bad guys when it comes to the environment. What I want you to learn about today, there's really four main takeaways. I want you to learn a little bit about our country, both the geography and the history around conservation, get a sense of kind of how did we end up where we are today. I'm going to share with you a few of the limitations to traditional approaches to nature conservation. Give you a quick introduction to Canada's 2030 nature strategy and some of the optimism, also caution we should maybe be feeling about that initiative. And then end it off with talking about how One Health can help to solve some of the complex conservation questions that are facing us today. So the first thing I want you to know is that people have always had environmental problems, as long as there have been groups of people living together. And there's a whole literature about past civilizations that have collapsed, at least in part because of local or regional environmental degradation. And even in southern Ontario, if we could get in our time machine and go back to the 1900s or 1910s, you wouldn't recognize much of the landscape. A lot of the forests were removed, and it was really kind of that being on that edge of that environmental catastrophe that led to tree planting programs, eventually things like conservation authorities, which have served us very well into today. The big difference is that these environmental challenges, they're not local or regional. They've been scaled up to our whole planet. So we are the first people that are sort of facing this massive planetary change. And we've altered huge areas of both our terrestrial and our marine ecosystems. Be it from plastics that you can find in animals in the Arctic to avian flu and seals and albatross in Antarctica. Like, our human footprint is really everywhere on this planet. And scientists have identified, we've surpassed a lot of what are sometimes called our planetary boundaries, or the safe operating systems of our planet. If you think of it as a human body, it's like your heart's working well, but your cholesterol's way off and your liver's starting to fail. Some of these are really well known to the general public, like climate change is certainly well known, but things like just the massive changes that are happening in our freshwater and our terrestrial systems, and the loss of nature, biodiversity, which is my main area of study. Now, it's easy to think, well, those problems are happening somewhere else. We're in, Canada, where we have lots of nature. And you're right. Canada has some of the last high-integrity ecosystems left on the planet. Indeed, some of the largest intact forests left in the world are not in the Amazon, but they're here in Canada. But southern Canada, it's a different story. We have hammered the landscape as hard as anywhere else on the planet. And places in southern Ontario have less forest cover than tropical countries that are the poster nations of deforestation. And so as Canadians, we do have this really unique conservation challenge ahead of us. How can we protect some of these last wild places left on the planet in our northern lands under the pressure of critical minerals and another development? At the same time, how can we restore some of these heavily impacted landscapes where most Canadians live and work in our south? And we are standing at the threshold of the sixth extinction. It's sort of debated, are we there or not, but we're certainly getting closer. The first planetary extinctions were caused by things like asteroids hitting the planet and volcanic activity, but this one's being caused by me and you and everything else that we're doing on the planet. Extinction rates are greatly accelerated, and it's been estimated that up to 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Now, it's important that it's at risk, right? This is sort of the decision point where we're at right now. This hasn't happened yet. If we look at Canada, there's a growing number of species that we've lost from our country. And some of them, like the great auk and passenger pigeon, it's easy to think, well, those are things that happened in the past, but rates of extinction are continuing to accelerate. The only reason why it's kind of flatlined at the very top is because we don't have enough data yet. Not enough time has passed to say that those species are gone or not. And the threats to these species are really the threats to biodiversity and to the benefits that nature provides to people. Historically, if we look at the drivers of species loss, it was overexploitation. Often things that were really common were heavily exploited, especially if they congregated in small areas. It made it very easy for unsustainable harvest. Habitat loss is by far the prevalent loss of species, primarily in southern Canada, and especially for things that just live in small ranges. They don't occur over large areas of Canada. Modifications to our ecosystem. So even within parks and protected areas, we're seeing species being lost because of invasive species or modifications to hydrological systems or natural fire regimes, be it fire suppression or extreme fires that we're having. And we are seeing some species that are blinking out because of climate change. That may be because of higher sea levels, more storm surges, or species in alpine areas that simply can move up the mountain, but eventually they run out of mountain as they try to adapt to these changing conditions. And there's lots of species that disappeared where we really don't know why this has occurred. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got to this place, to this world where we are losing biodiversity. So we're going to do a little bit of a history, drop in at some different decades, just to see what the common discourse was around conservation, what people were thinking. I just do want to highlight, this is my interpretation of conservation history. There's a much richer history related to Indigenous peoples and their role in the environment. Two things I want you to know, though, is that first of all, often we describe North America when settlers came as kind of this vast open wilderness. Not true. There were people here. In a lot of cases, those human populations had declined because of diseases. And the other thing was that Indigenous people managed nature. So in Southern Ontario, we have all kinds of examples of prairie or woodland ecosystems where Indigenous people used prescribed fire and other management techniques. And those techniques tended to increase the diversity and the abundance of wildlife. But we're going to start our time machine. We're going to go back into the late 1700s. Now, I really hate using an American example, especially today, to start off my presentation. But this is a report that was done by Thomas Jefferson. That's the Thomas Jefferson, I think, third president of the United States. And if you look at the very top of his list of mammals of the Americas, the one is mammoth. And not extinct, people thought that there were mammoths at that time, and that's because in the late 1700s, the concept of extinction, the fact that species could disappear, was foreign. And there's lots of different reasons for this, but the belief at that time was that there still were mammoths. We found bones of them in caves of Kentucky and Virginia. They must be somewhere else. And this was even one of the reasons for the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was go explore the West and you'll probably find mammoths out there, which of course didn't happen. This sort of extinction ignorance, extinction denialism, really kind of lasted for a long time in our history. Massive populations of things like passenger pigeon or great auk or bison were over-harvested. In the Great Lakes, we had these huge populations of things like lake sturgeon, one of the species I'm working on now, and they were so abundant they were dried and burned for fuel wood. So there's just recognition that this thought that game was essentially inexhaustible. Although that did trigger some of the first game laws in North America. If we fast forward to the late 1800s, it was really the birth of protected and conserved areas, which have a very complicated past. Places like Banff National Park, excluded the Stony Cree to establish protected areas, and that was sort of the modus operandum of protected areas for a long time. And also they were established for very different reasons. I mean, Banff was really established for tourism. Algonquin, you can see on this map, it's called Algonquin National Park, because back then we didn't really have provincial or national parks. They just called it National Park. It's interesting because it really was established for watershed protection, to protect it from forest clearing, but also to help fur bearers recover. The one place you may not recognize is Last Mountain Lake Bird Sanctuary, established in 1887. Arguably, that's the first protected area for biodiversity in North America. The focus really was on protecting places for migratory birds. And the US didn't have an example of a protected area for biodiversity until later in Florida. Fast forward into the 1900s, we started to see protected areas established for wildlife conservation. So it's when places like Point Pelee, Elk Island, Wood Buffalo National Parks were established largely for the specific purpose of protecting declining populations of wildlife. Canada established the first parks branch, which is kind of cool. And also there started to be some international agreements to protect wildlife, recognition that things like fur seals and migratory birds couldn't just be managed by one jurisdiction, that they had to be a shared responsibility for conservation. We go past the Second World Wars into the 50s and 60s, which is really the birth of the modern environmental movement, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring to raise the awareness of the problems of contaminants in our food chain. It's a time when if you were to look at the rivers here in Guelph or go down to Toronto, you would be horrified by what they looked like back then. Rivers in the Great Lakes, including the Cuyahoga River, used to light on fire because of industrial pollution. Sewage was being dumped directly into the lakes. Now that was a real rallying cry, and we saw a lot of demands to improve the quality of our lands and waters. It was also when we started to create global lists of endangered species. It wasn't until 1964, and also saw that rapid expansion of park systems, partly for nature, but partly because of an increased interest in recreation. The results of the environmental movement really was a lot of helpful legislation for the environment. Legislation around endangered species. There's Republican Nixon signing the US Endangered Species Act back in 1973. Canada had a similar act that was later updated. Saw things like DDT being banned, Montreal Protocol that was a response to the hole in the ozone layer. And there was also this new language developing around conservation, things like sustainable development. Can we balance the economy and the environment? The word biodiversity was first introduced in the 1980s, and this new science of conservation biology, trying to protect and restore nature. The 1990s was a really critical year or decade for environmental legislation. The Acid Rain Treaty. Again, Republican Bush, conservative Mulroney signing the Acid Rain Treaty. When I was a kid, I was sure there wasn't going to be any fish in places like Algonquin Park because of acid rain, but because of this international treaty, that's largely been solved. The Kyoto Protocol, which was the first global treaty on greenhouse gas emissions. And from a biodiversity perspective, maybe most importantly, the Convention on Biodiversity, which is really kind of the precursor to Canada's 2030 biodiversity plan. We jump ahead a little bit more into the decade that we've just finished. We had the decade of biodiversity, the Paris Agreement, and also sustainable development goals. So moving beyond the concept of sustainability, think about what are some of the actual goals that we want to achieve, which was really a way of kind of getting businesses to think more about their role in protecting the environment. So despite all of this success, 150 years of conservation, we're still living in a world where, although there's incredible bright spots in terms of species that we've recovered or places we've protected, we're continuing to lose ecosystems and continuing to lose species. And we're sort of at this inflection point right now where we need to decide if we're going to go business as usual and leave a more homogeneous and less diverse planet, or can we turn things around and actually halt and reverse the loss of nature, which is both kind of daunting but also sort of exciting to think that we could actually be the first generation of people on the planet to reverse the continued decline of our natural world. So the next decade, the one we're in now, it's kind of for us to be written. I don't know what will be on this slide in 10 years from now. we do have a good starting point, though. We have the Global Biodiversity Framework. So building from the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Biodiversity Framework that was just signed a couple years ago is an agreement by most countries, including Canada, to halt and reverse the loss of nature, and has this vision of living in harmony with the natural world. The Global Biodiversity Framework has 23 different targets. Now, some of these, the ones in green, are kind of like the conservation we've been doing for a while. Protect and conserved areas, that's parks and protected areas, halting extinctions and reducing extinction risk. You know, that's the species work that we've been doing for a while. It also gets into sort of the orangey or sort of salmon color ones, which are about sustainable use of resources. So, I mean, stuff that we've been thinking about for a while. But then it kind of gets into these blue areas, which are really some kind of like different approaches in terms of integrating biodiversity into multiple values around policy. So having a biodiversity lens on kind of everything that we do. And also, it's essentially mainstreaming biodiversity. Now, no conservation organization can implement this. No government can implement this. No business can implement this. It really, just by its design, requires us to work together. Every country needs to develop a biodiversity strategy coming out of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and this is Canada's. You can go online. It's limited because the federal government only has so much jurisdiction about what they can do around biodiversity in Canada. Most of it falls to the provinces and to the territories. But some of the stuff in here, it's a good nucleus. And if we can build enough mass around it, it is an opportunity for transformative change. I mean, things in here like the vision, where Canadians have reestablished their relationship and they're honoring their responsibilities to nature. I mean, this is like deep ecology stuff from the 1960s. And also recognizing pillars like we need to take integrated holistic approaches and whole of government and whole of society approaches. So it's really recognizing that nature and nature conservation, it's too big and it's too important for one sector of society, and it really is something that everyone needs to participate in. So how do we do this? I mean, certainly our past approaches of economy versus ecology aren't going to work if we're going to take a whole of society integrated approach to solving these complex problems around nature. So for me, I mean, one of the biggest changes that I had in my career was this realization that I was probably doing too much talking when I was interacting with other groups around conservation issues. And I distinctly remember we were on Pelee Island. If people recognize Pelee Island, you're probably either a bird watcher or a wine drinker. Incredible spot, lots of biodiversity. But there was a period, this was in the mid-2000s, Species at Risk Act had been introduced. There's all kinds of endangered species on Pelee Island. Local people were not happy, very suspicious of conservation and what was happening. I was working for Nature Conservancy of Canada. We hired a community consultant to try to convene people just so we could talk to some of the people on the island about what was happening, what we wanted to do. And I remember we had this meeting. We were out there. The mayor was there. There were a bunch of local farmers. And the consultant said, well, you know, tell them why you're interested in conservation on Pelee Island. And I went on a speech about areas of natural and scientific interest and island biogeography and endemic species and species at risk and things like that. And I remember afterwards, you know, I was kind of giving myself shivers. I thought it was so great that there was kind of this silence. And the community consultant said, well, you know, that was great, Dan. Now tell them why it matters for them, And it was kind of this switch in thinking where, you know, I had been saying why it matters to me and my values, but I wasn't really listening to why it mattered to the people who lived and worked on the island. And so, you know, I think that sometimes through conservation, like we want others to do different things, but there's also things that we can do to approach these problems differently. So traditionally, you know, places or species like this is how I would talk about them. You know, species at risk, wetlands, protected areas. And you know, for a certain group of people, this resonates, right? But not everyone values nature in those same ways. And by just telling people what you feel, you may actually not be able to hear what they feel or how they value these places. So local people may value these same places, but for different reasons. It could be for health and well-being, hunting and fishing, could be legacy for future generations. And by listening first to how they value and then reflecting that back to them is an important way to build common ground conservation. I think a really, really important message around conservation is that there is a lot of support. You know, people are connected to nature and do want to protect nature. These are some fairly recent polls from both Canada and the US around things like endangered species or protecting Great Lakes or protected areas. And this is very high level of support, right? Like any politician would love to see numbers like this. Like we're talking 80, 90% of people are supporting these sorts of things. So I think it's an important message. Conservation is not divided. And we need to make sure it doesn't become divided and polarized like has happened with climate change. However, how we value nature is diverse. And as conservationists, we need to make sure that we're addressing that diversity and listening to that diversity and integrating it into our conservation strategies. So I'm very interested in wildlife. This is a great survey looking at how people across Canada value wildlife. So again, most people value wildlife. So it's not divided, but it is diverse. So very quickly, I mean, these groups, people who value wildlife from a traditional perspective, largely rural. These are people who generally see that we should dominate nature. People who hunt, fish are often in this group. Mutualists are people who value nature for intrinsic value. Pluralists are those that kind of have a little bit of both. And then distance are an interesting group because they don't think about nature at all. They're a complicated group too, because some of them are urban and they're just too busy to think about nature. Some of them are probably either new Canadians or just economically, they don't have, it's not a high priority for them. It is a group that's growing in Canada and we need to watch this. But a couple key messages here is that pretty homogenous across Canada. I mean, there's differences, like more traditionalists in Alberta than Ontario. That may be because of like rural versus urban population. But it's pretty consistent. The biggest groups are mutualists and pluralists. So a lot of people who do value nature for intrinsic values. Now, why we value nature differently? There's a lot of different reasons. It can be your culture, where you grew up, who your friends are, things like that. There's an approach in social sciences around moral foundations theory. And that's it. We're all kind of born with these 6 moral foundations. Somebody described it to me as kind of taste buds. We all have them. It just, we may prefer sort of different things within them. Some people are very strong in terms of harm and care. We don't want, it's sort of an equity one. Some people around fairness and cheating. For other people, authority and subversion. Some people are, they want to support teams. Other people want to see things more independent. And you can see the graph kind of sort of lays these out in terms of, where you are on the political spectrum. This is in the US. The important thing is, this is, everyone has a little bit of these in them, but it's really important to try to understand, what are the moral foundations of the people that you're talking to? Because if I'm talking to someone who is very big on loyalty, it may be that they don't want a conservation organization coming in and telling them what to do in their local area. But they may respond, very well when you talk about, all the things that their family has done to protect nature on the property and the legacy that they can leave their children. The other complication around nature conservation is not only do we have people who value nature for a whole bunch of different reasons, but we've tended to put the governance of nature into all of these different silos. And this can be governments, it can be universities, any big institutions. So, things like water, that flow through all of us, is managed by health, it's managed by natural resources, it's managed by environment and agriculture. And I think one of the things with One Health is that we can break down some of these silos and try to find the solutions that lie in between them. And certainly, One Health, this connection between animals, both domestic and wild, people and the environment, is a key way, I think, of creating connections between people and trying to find some of the solutions that aren't within these silos but kind of lie in the interstitial spaces between them. One of my first sort of tastes of One Health, although I didn't call it One Health, I didn't know it was One Health at that time, was a few years ago. We're developing biodiversity strategies for the Great Lakes, binational biodiversity strategies. And these involve bringing diverse people into the room. Now, not too diverse. I would say this was One Health light, but it was bringing people into a room that hadn't met each other before, yet all worked on this same system of the Great Lakes. And one of the incredible things that I found about that process was that the outcome was good, the plans, but it was sort of the connections that were made between people at those meetings. And finding that people from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had things in common with nature conservation groups. And I think that really helped to create these strategies that had input from a lot of different organizations. Now, I say it wasn't a totally a One Health approach, and that's one thing I've been interested in, is just trying to define what exactly is a One Health approach, because we're seeing it more and more in things like Canada's nature strategy, that we should take a One Health approach. So what exactly does that involve? And some of the different elements of One Health, like what goes into the recipe, is a little bit different, but I think some of the key ingredients, we've kind of broken them down into people's policies and processes. I mean, people, you have to involve collaboration from professionals from health, vets, environmental science, but other relevant fields. Local communities, especially for local projects, need to be involved, and ideally there's some kind of a community champion that you have. It can't be seen as something that's coming from top down, but also having a government champion that can create those connections for a whole of government approach and provide some policy and even funding support is critical. In terms of the policy, there need to be mechanisms for sharing data. There has to be transparency. That policy and regulations are developed with input from multiple sectors that sustain the commitment. I mean, one of the challenges is that funding cycles are often on 1 or 2 or 3 year cycles, but solving these problems is going to take decades potentially. And also identifying, are there mechanisms to support change management and transitions? And local communities, when you're asking local actors to do something different, how can you support them in making those changes? And then finally, processes, making sure that we are looking at things holistically and not just kind of a collection of isolated solutions, looking at key drivers, and really kind of considering ecosystem and biodiversity health as one of the main parts of One Health, reducing health risk, and are they resilient to climate change and the emerging approach, and does it promote sustainable long-term sustainable resource use and health benefits to people and ecosystems. So I do find One Health can be a little bit abstract. I just want to talk to you about sort of a specific example where we're starting to think about how One Health approaches could benefit nature, animals, and people. And this is in the Maitland Valley watershed. If you were to get on that rail trail in Guelph and go for 130 kilometers or whatever, you'd end up in Goderich, which is at the far end of the map here. Lovely area, nice mix of forests and farmlands, families that have been there for generations, but also has a lot of problems. And a lot of these, it's like a little microcosm of the world. They're losing biodiversity, even places that are protected, those environments are becoming degraded. Seeing impacts of climate change, including drought and flooding, soil erosion, the image on the bottom, that's high quality agricultural soil that's going out in the Lake Erie. And the question is, can we use One Health approaches to solve all of these problems and to try to solve them in an efficient and holistic perspective? So, as one example, here's a property where different solutions are being implemented. And now some of these are old solutions. Things like windbreaks have been around for as long as there have been farms. But other things like creating swales to hold stormwater back, that's relatively new. That's essentially creating stormwater management like we have in urban areas within agricultural landscapes. But implementing these, and if they can be implemented at scale, really does provide a One Health solution because it actually solves a lot of problems very, very efficiently. And not just on the farm, but for the community and for the watershed. So for example, by doing things like wetland restoration, we're building climate resilience. Things like wetlands can hold back floodwaters. That's helping both biodiversity, but also communities. This type of restoration work supports local economies. It's helping to protect things like agriculture and tourism, avoiding costs of things like water treatment, right? If we can keep the water clean, that avoids filtration costs when that water is used for drinking water. And also it does create jobs, and there's been economic studies around the Great Lakes, for example, finding that for every dollar that we invest in restoration, we get $10 back in terms of economic benefit. It supports the farmers, the main land use in that area. The healthy ecosystems provide water that support agricultural productivity and also soil as well, and soil health, which supports the long-term sustainability of those agricultural systems. Can help to prevent things like waterborne diseases, things like E. coli that can show up in the water, helps protect those beaches downstream, so there's fewer beach closures, which is good for both health and the economy. And also there's just increasing evidence that living in healthy natural environments is good for your mental health and also good for your physical health. And maybe most importantly, One Health approach can help to just shift culture and values around conservation. It encourages community involvement. It asks community members what they want to do. Creates public awareness that can inform people about their environment and hopefully taking pride and ownership about what they're doing. And we know people who are engaged in and aware of environmental issues are more likely to support local conservation efforts. So I just want to end off with a few sort of final thoughts about One Health, especially for any students here around One Health. I think it's important to recognize that there's no mathematical formula, there's no IKEA instructions for solving complex problems. And these are complex problems. I had somebody recently say to me, conservation, well, it's not rocket science. Well, it's actually a little harder than rocket science. Not to insult rocket scientists, but a rocket scientist, if you have a blueprint for a rocket, you can build that rocket again and again and again. Conservation is very different. The lessons that you learn at Pelee Island are not going to necessarily apply to Alberta or to downtown Toronto. So there is this complex thinking that does need to go on. And One Health doesn't teach you what to know, but it does teach you how to think differently, to find these solutions. And also, though, it is more than just bringing a bunch of people together to have a meeting. Sharing and listening is important, but essentially, and fundamentally, One Health, it is transdisciplinary. So we have to be ready to change our opinions around people and politics, because if we want to transform the world, sometimes that actually starts with transforming how we think. And while One Health is a new discipline, it's also rooted in very old ways of knowing. People have been solving complex problems for a long time in our villages, in our towns, but now we have to solve these at a planetary scale. They've been upscaled to continents, to oceans, and to our entire planet. And as students of One Health, we're solving problems that really do need to be solved, from pandemics to climate change to biodiversity loss. And really the stakes couldn't be much higher. This is our decision decade. What we do in the next 10 years is going to decide the fate of nature and the benefits that nature provides for generations to come. Thanks.